Hello everyone and welcome back to the Knitted Blooms Quilt Along. We have arrived at week 5. So by this point you should have all of your small flower units created, all of your rows 1 through 8 created for all of your blocks. Now we are going to do our block assembly. So we are going to sew all of our rows together to create each of the blocks that go within our quilt. If you are just now tuning in, be sure to go back and watch the previous quilt along videos. You'll want to catch up before you move forward with this week. But I have given this step 2 weeks. So week 5 and 6 are the same. They're both for block assembly. So whenever you're ready, let's dive in. Each block has 4 identical quadrants, but they're all rotated a little bit differently. Then there is sashing that is in between the quadrants, and that is what all comes together to create our block. So first we're going to start off by making our quadrants. So if you are making the traditional 2-color version or the 4-color version, all of your blocks are going to look identical, and this is a really great opportunity for you to just go through and chain piece all of your row 1s to your small flower unit, press those seams, then come back and chain piece all of your row 2s, and so on. But if you're making the modern version, which is what I am doing for the quilt along, I will go through and work on these pieces block by block. Now you could do it either way. I am really excited to see these blocks come together. I'm using prints for the first time with this pattern. I really want to kind of assemble my blocks as quickly as possible. I'm anxious and excited to see them come together. So I'm going to work through this block by block. So I take one of my piles and I work on that pile, and then I will make that block and then move on to the next block. So at this point in the process, you will start to see, if you haven't already, why your seam allowance is so important for this quilt. So whenever you have your small flower unit and you place your row 1 right sides together to that small flower unit to sew that seam, if your row 1 measures what it's supposed to, but your small flower unit doesn't, then your pieces are going to be a little bit off and vice versa. So as you're adding your rows to your small flower units, you're making this log cabin that you see in the pattern. It's going to continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And your pieces really should be fitting together like a puzzle piece. So if your rows, whenever you put them right sides together, are a little bit longer than the piece that you're sewing it to, then that might be because your seam allowance was off somewhere along the line. So we really want to check as we're sewing, making sure that our quadrants are measuring exactly what we want them to. Like before, I tend to sew a little bit on the scant side. So I will sometimes have just some tiny little areas where I need to square it up at the end. I'll do that once I construct my entire quadrant together, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. But just keep in mind that your seam allowance, we really want to be paying close attention to that as we're sewing these rows together. It's also important to keep your pattern close by. We are referring to the diagram on page 11 if you're using the printed copy. It is page 13 if you have the PDF copy of the pattern. So we're referring to that flower quadrant. It's really easy to get those rows kind of flipped around as you're sewing them together. So pay close attention to this diagram. I like to keep it right beside my sewing machine to make sure that I have all of my rows rotated correctly. So you will first take all of your row 1s, whether you're doing one block at a time or making all of your flower quadrants at the same time. You're going to take your row 1s, make sure it's rotated correctly, double check the diagram, and I'm going to just chain piece all of my row 1s to all 4 of my flower units that are in this block. Now for the seams that are going to be on the outside perimeter of the blocks, I like to backstitch those because we are going to have some of these blocks that are on the perimeter of the quilt and they can become unraveled relatively easily. So I like to go ahead and just backstitch that little area just to be safe. I like to use pins both whenever my rows get a little bit more long. It's easier for those rows to get stretched and warped and distorted as you're sewing. So pins really help with that. And also if you have any intersections where you really want your fabrics to line up, Pins can really help with that as well. I will sew right off the other end. I'm not going to backstitch both edges, only the edge that I know is going to be on the outside perimeter of my block. Then I go through and snip my threads, and then I will press my seams open. You might choose to use a tailor's clapper or flatter spray or a wool pressing mat, just like before. If you want to try to get this seam extra flat, those are great tools that you can use. Then I will go and sew my row 2s, and I'm going to repeat this exact same process, double checking my diagram and the pattern, making sure that I have my pieces all rotated correctly. Another thing to keep in mind, circling back to the seam allowance conversation, if your row is a little bit larger than what it needs to be, then I like to have my overhang, my extra fabric overhang on the perimeter of my quadrant, and then that way whenever I sew my block together, I can square up the edges of my quadrant. So just keep that in mind. Your background fabric, if your row is a little bit bigger than you want, maybe position that so that it's overhanging around the perimeter of where your quadrant will be, and then you can square that up a little bit more easily. Again, I'll show you what that looks like in just a few seconds. Remember, in between rows 3 and 5, and then also rows 4 and 6, we have some areas where we really want to pay attention to our seams lining up. So this is right there, kind of where they join up right beside each other. So we really want to use pins. I like to start at that intersection with my first pin, and then I'll go out and pin from there. So just keep that in mind as you're working on rows 3 and 5, and then also 4 and 6. So then you're just going to repeat this exact same process. You're going to press all of your seams open, go through and sew all of your rows together until you have all 8 rows sewn together log cabin style according to the pattern. Remember to keep an eye on your measurements. Once my quadrants are made, I like to take a large ruler and double check the size of my quadrant. I want it to measure exactly what the pattern says. So if I need to trim away a little bit, then I will go ahead and do that. It shouldn't be too much fabric, just a couple of thread widths of fabric here and there. I'll want to make sure that those edges are nice and square before I move on to the next step. Then once you have all of your quadrants made, you will want to create your block sashing. Now for the modern version, we just individually piece those sashing pieces and our foreground small flower pieces together. We're going to have 4 of those units. This is the bottom of page 16 in the paper copy. In the digital copy, we are on the bottom of page 18. So I just go through and do that for each block once I have all of my quadrants assembled. Remember that these fabrics are from the same block pile that we have been working from to create this particular block. So the fabrics should mimic the small flower units that are in the outer quadrants of this block. If you are making the 4-color or the traditional version, you are going to be doing more strip piecing to create your block sashing units. So refer to the instructions within the pattern to do that. You're going to want to go ahead and create all of your block sashing pieces Just like whenever we created our rows, you're going to be strip piecing, pressing the seam, and then cutting it apart. Then that brings us to our block assembly. So this is when we are getting so close to the finish line. I cannot wait whenever I get to this step. I'm so excited to see my blocks come together. So this is a really, really exciting part of the pattern. So looking at the modern and 4-color and traditional, the instructions are all basically the same, but there are specific diagrams within your pattern. So we are going to lay out our pieces. I like to go ahead and lay out my block to see what it'll look like, and then I'm going to chain piece my rows. Then I will press my seams open, and then I will continue to chain piece to create all 3 of my rows within my block. For those longer seams, I definitely recommend pinning. I like to start in the middle and then add pins by working my way out from the center. I like to make sure that I really get my points lined up and then I work out from there. So remember to backstitch. I like to backstitch around any seam that is going to be on the outside perimeter of my block. If you forget to do that step, it really isn't that big of a deal, but just keep that in mind whenever we go to sew all of our blocks together. With sewing long seams, sometimes the way that your quilt is draping off of your table as you're sewing, as you're pinning, even during the basting process, if you're quilting it yourself, sometimes those seams can pull apart if they're around the edge of your quilt top. So that's why I just try to be really vigilant, especially with this pattern, because there are so many seams in these blocks, to backstitch each seam just to make sure that they stay really, really secure throughout this process. So remember, we're pressing all of our seams open. Remember to use a tailor's clapper, flatter spray, wool pressing mat, any of those tools that you want to get your seams extra flat. And then you are done with your first block. So we are going to set that aside, make sure it stays nice and flat. You can use something like a design wall to hang up all of your blocks, or you can just stack them on a table. One thing that I also like to do is sometimes I will take the biggest ruler that I have and place it on top of my blocks, and then place something heavy on that. Since these blocks are so big, you could do this at the quadrant stage. Once you have made your quadrants, stack those all on top of each other, put your ruler on top, and then something heavy. Then you can leave that overnight, or at least for several hours maybe, and then that helps press your seams extra flat over an extended period of time. So sometimes I will do that. For this quilt, again, since the blocks are kind of extra large, you might want to do that at the quadrant stage before you do your block assembly. Okay, so then we are going to repeat this process to make all of our blocks in our quilt top. We have 2 weeks for this step. So weeks 5 and week 6 are all about block assembly. So feel free to go through and divvy up your block assembly however you would like over the next 2 weeks. And then the week after that, week 7, is a catch-up week. So if you technically want to take 3 weeks for this step, that works too. Or you can take week 7 off, and then week 8, we will be sewing all of our blocks together for quilt top assembly. So we are almost at the finish line. I am so excited to see everyone's blocks come together. It's been super fun to follow along over on Instagram and to see everyone's progress in our inbox. We love getting pictures and seeing what you all are up to, seeing all of the beautiful fabrics that you all pick out. This has just been such a fun quilt to make together. So thank you for joining along. We do have prizes for weeks 5 and week 6. There's going to be 2 winners, one for each week. and we are going to be giving away, I'm gonna call it Brittany's Favorite Things bundle. So there are 3 things in this bundle. The first is a Gretchen Quinn mug. If you saw our booth at QuiltCon a couple of weeks ago, we had some Gretchen Quinn mugs in our booth, and we've gotten a lot of questions about where to get those mugs from. So you can just go directly to Gretchen Quinn, her Instagram. She also has a website. But I am just an enormous fan of her pottery. I first met her, we were both vending at a local craft show, and we had booths that were close to each other, and it was love at first sight with her pottery. So I have lots of vases and mugs, all of our plates and bowls. I don't know, I just get the warm and fuzzies whenever I use her pottery. So we're gonna be giving away a coffee mug, your choice of the design. We are also giving away a puzzle from one of my favorite puzzle designers. I'm currently working on this puzzle right now. It is super fun. It's 1,000 pieces. It has been on our countertop for at least 2 months now, I think. So I'm almost done with it. I'm really excited, but I've been eyeing lots of her designs, and I just think that they're so fun and happy, and I love all of the colors in them. So a puzzle of your choice from this designer. And then we're also going to be doing pre-made Bessie Pearl binding. So this is pre-made binding. I have used this binding recently. I made a quilted vest that I wore at QuiltCon. This was my first quilted garment. I had so much fun making it. And I think that the pre-made binding, especially when it's bias binding, is just super, super convenient. Bias binding, it's not that hard to make, but it's just kind of an extra step. And since I was already trying something new for the first time with this vest, I wanted to just hit the easy button and get pre-made binding. And so I went to Bessie Pearl. She's also local to North Carolina. And you are going to win your choice of binding from her shop. She has lots of beautiful prints to choose from, also beautiful solids. You can get them straight grain binding, or you can also get bias binding. So those 3 prizes are gonna go to 2 lucky winners: a Gretchen Quinn coffee mug, a puzzle of your choice, and then also the pre-made binding. So to enter to win, you're gonna share a progress photo to social media. You are going to use the hashtags Knitted Blooms QAL, Knitted Blooms Quilt, and Lo and Behold Patterns, and then you'll tag Lo and Behold Stitchery in the photo, and then you are entered. So we will pick a winner at the end of each week, and we will announce it in the let's see, it'll probably be in the week 8 blog post. Just keep an eye out. We will make sure that we get all of the winners picked and shared, and we will get your prizes to you ASAP. So again, thank you so much for tuning in. I cannot wait to see your progress this week, and let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye for now.